often when we take those two words and put them in the context of Christianity in our faith, we divorce from any sort of reason and confuse it with hope. Hope's not a bad thing, but it's not what we're talking about today. But for some reason, when it comes to religion or Christianity, when it comes for the word, they just take on a whole life of their own. They become a snowball effect, and all of a sudden they just have very little meaning. They have little meaning to people that you're trying to share your faith with, because we divorce it from any sort of reason. You might just say, or maybe you've heard this said to you, well, you just have to believe. You just have to believe. Some people would say, like maybe surface, you just got to believe, bro. Like, just believe. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about all the other factors that are going on. You just got to believe. Well, you just have to have more faith. You got to believe. You got to have more faith. What does that even mean? You either believe in something or you don't. There's no, you're not going to have more of it. You either believe or you don't. It doesn't take on a special meaning when we go put in the context of Christianity. And you know what John, the writer of the gospel, John's response would be by saying, you just got to believe or you just have to have more faith? His response would be, really? Says who? Who says that? Where are you going to find that? You know what Peter's response would be? Really? I didn't hear Jesus speak about that at all. Jesus' response would be, well, I never had that in my teaching. That's not in the New Testament. Where are you getting this that you just have to believe? You just have to have more faith. I love what Frank Turek says, and I'm going to get to that in a second. Because as we journey through the Gospel of John, we're going to discover a different paradigm than you just got to believe. You just got to have more faith. Frank Turek says this, and he's somebody that debates at colleges and goes around in the States and takes on really anyone that will step in the ring with him. The reason why so many people are easily talked out of Christianity is because they were never talked into it in the first place. They were told, you just got to believe. You just got to have faith. That's what we tell our kids, right? You just got to believe. But what happens? We grow up. All of a sudden, like the problems that you face as a child are nowhere close to what you face as an adult, and you just got to believe just doesn't cut it anymore. It just doesn't cut it. And then your kids leave home, and then they get talked out of Christianity because they were never talked into it in the first place. Maybe that's where maybe you're sitting here and that's you. Maybe that's where you're sitting, and you're just told, you just got to believe, bro. Just have more faith, sis. And you read a book that sort of debunked your faith, and you're like, all right, I'm out. Because you didn't have anything to base your Christianity upon, your faith upon, and so you were talked out of it. You watched a TikToker make a really good observation about the Bible, and you never really taught about the Bible, and so you're like, yep, I'm out. That person has a really good point. My faith, it's gone. Why? Because so many of us are talked out of it because we were never talked into it. We're just told, son, you just got to believe. You just got to believe. John, the Apostle John, he would agree. He would agree that this you just got to believe, you just got to have faith, just doesn't cut it. It cuts it as a child. But as we grow older, well, that's just not the case. The Apostle John didn't choose to follow Jesus because of faith. He didn't choose to follow Jesus because of faith. He would caution you that that's not why we follow Jesus. We don't follow Jesus because of faith. And as we're about to discover, there's a difference between by faith and because of faith. There's a big difference between by faith and because of faith. John left his father's fishing business to follow Jesus, not because of he had faith, but because of what he saw, because of who he saw, because of what Jesus did. It was what he saw, not because of faith. And John was somebody that he outlived his friends, and he was probably like the last remaining apostle. And I think that we don't know when John wrote the Gospel of John, but it was probably towards the end of his life. And so I'm sure someone came to John and says, John, you got to document this story. You got to document not your faith, You got to document what you have seen, what you have witnessed. John, we have Peter's account. We have Peter's account. We have Matthew's account. We have Luke's account. John, we need to hear your perspective of things. Because when John's writing this, I'm going to sound like a broken record. He was not writing the Bible. He was writing what he had witnessed. He didn't know this was going to end up in the Bible. The Bible was not a thing to him at this point. He was writing something that he had seen, something extraordinary, and we're going to discover why it was so important for John to write this gospel, the gospel of John, the good news of John. And he wasn't just content, John wasn't, to just tell us what happened. He tells us why, not just what. He gets into the why, and at the end of the account, this is going to take you back to when you were in school, he writes like his purpose statement. When you would write your thesis or you would write some sort of exam, an essay, oh my goodness, essays, I was horrible at essays. But he wrote his purpose statement at the end as to why he's writing this. Jesus, John says, performed many other signs. I want you to remember that word signs because we're going to be talking about that a little bit. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, right? We read book, we assume Bible, but again, there was no Bible. John didn't know there was going to be a Bible. So John is talking about this book, the Gospel of John, which we call it today, is there are not all the signs are recorded in this book, and which makes you ask the question, well, why did John choose the signs that he chose as we're going to go through the Gospel of John? Why did he choose the ones that we're going to focus on over the next 6 weeks? And that's going to be a really interesting thing as we discover why he chose what he chose. But these are written that you may believe. Believe what? What's he wanting us to believe? Is it just, you just got to believe, brother? You just got to have faith? He's not telling his audience what to believe. He's building his case as to why they should believe. He's not telling them what to believe. He's building the case as to why they should believe. But what's he asking us to believe? Well, that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is indeed who he claimed to be. He wasn't just a random man that did really cool tricks that fooled us all. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And that by believing, you may have life in his name. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Why should we do that? Or what happens when we believe? By believing, you may have life, and life in his name. John would say, just like I have. This is what I've experienced. This is what I have witnessed. This is how it has changed my life. This is why I am asking you to believe, and I'm going to build my case as to why I think you should believe, and that you will have life in his name. But it's really interesting, the sequence that John lays out as to how he went from a follower to a believer. There's a sequence that we all go through, or maybe that we all should go through, but we all haven't gone through. Because the sequence of John's following is there were events that took place, but these events weren't just random events, as it turns out. These events were signs, right? And when you're driving, what do signs do? They point you to somewhere. They point you to something. These events were signs that pointed to evidence that Jesus was who he was claiming to be, and that you would believe that he is who he says he is, and then you will trust in him. So there were events that turned out to be signs, and these signs were evidence saying, and because of the evidence, we believe that Jesus is who he says he is, and we can trust in him. Notice how John just didn't put trust in at the very top. He didn't just say, well, I just got to believe, and then hope everything works out. I'm just going to trust in him, and then, I'm sure everything will just work out. No matter what comes my way in my life, everything will just be fine. No. There's a sequence of events. There's events that were signs, that were evidence that Jesus is who he says he is, and we believe that that's the case, and then we put our trust in him. It wasn't just faith that moved John and the apostles. It wasn't just faith that moved them. It was what they witnessed. It is what they saw with their eyes. They were bystanders throughout Jesus' ministries. And we're lucky enough, in hindsight, to read the documentations that they have that we put in our Bible, and we call them the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of the accounts of Jesus' life. It was good enough for him, what he saw Jesus do. If it was good enough for him, well, he figured that it would be good enough for us. It would be good enough for his readers. So he organized his accounts around 7 events that served as signs. 7 signs. And over this series, Bystanders, we're going to look at all 7. We're going to look at the significance of each sign. But first, let me just say something interesting. It's interesting that John uses the term sign rather than the term miracle. He says sign, not miracle. Sign, not miracle. Because the supernatural things that Jesus did, they were not just random acts of kindness. Jesus never did anything that was random. They were signs that were pointing his followers to something. They were pointing it to Jesus' identity, that he is who he indeed says he is. And it was so easy, it's so easy for us to get entangled with the amazing signs that Jesus performed. But John is urging us, hey, don't get wrapped up with the signs. We want to be wrapped up with the person that the signs are pointing towards. Don't get all bogged down in just the signs. It's all about Jesus. It's all about what the signs are pointing towards. And this morning when we were in worship, I just had this tension that I couldn't ignore. That sometimes we come to church and we've got so much going on that in that 20 minutes of worship, we can so easily let everything else cloud that connection that we can have between us and our Heavenly Father. John's saying, let's not get bogged down in anything else except for the person of Jesus. We like to say at the Rock Christian family that the only thing that should get in between you and your relationship with God is who is Jesus? Who is Jesus? That's a question that we all have to answer for ourselves at some point in our life. Who is Jesus? Don't just believe. Because if you just believe, if you just tell your kids to just believe, they're going to be talked out of Christianity because they were never talked into it in the first place. All right. Let's move on. The first sign, this is the only one that rhymes. The first sign is water into wine. And again, John is writing this towards the end. He's recollecting all these details within his gospel. And this was such a well-documented event in history that he just assumed that all his readers would know what this was. It was so well-documented. I mean, different writers throughout the Bible documented this. It went through all of the land that this had happened. And he didn't even have to make a big deal over the miracle because everyone had heard it before. John 2, verse 1. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. And apparently Mary had a official catering or hosting role at this wedding. She had a role within this wedding. And on the 3rd day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. So John, he is there. He is at the wedding with Jesus. And wedding celebrations, as you may know, they would go for many days, 7 days. Rightfully so. I think being married is such a beautiful thing, and we should celebrate it and never get rid of the significance of marriage. And they would celebrate for days upon days. And that's what sets up what comes up next, because this would be a catastrophe. If your kids are getting married and you are organizing the wedding, maybe you're a really detailed planner, and what is about to happen to you, I think you would be just going crazy. I think you'd be like, oh my goodness, I've ruined the most important day in my son or my daughter's life. They're never going to forgive me for this. I didn't get the numbers right. And you would be freaking out a little bit. When the wine was gone, so they ran out of wine, right? They ran out of wine at this wedding. Apparently people were really letting it loose at this wedding and for 7 days, and all of a sudden there's no more wine. And maybe their reputation, this could take a hit on their reputation. And so this was going to be super embarrassing. And she knew in a crisis, Jesus' mother, to call upon her very resourceful son. Could you imagine having that resource in your house if Jesus was your child? Hey, Jesus, we ran out of milk. I'm going to turn my back. Can you do that thing? I don't know where it's coming from. The shops are shut, so we need some more milk for the coffee this morning because coffee is good for you. Woman, Jesus says. Men, no. No, we don't address anybody that way. But this is not a disrespectful term that Jesus was talking to Mary in. It was more like a really proper, like, my lady, like really formal. It wasn't disrespectful. I don't think Jesus would disrespect his mother that way. So it's like, my lady, why do you involve me? Why are you getting me involved in these shenanigans? My hour has not come. Mom, I've come to save the world, not weddings. Like, I'm here for something far greater than saving this wedding. My time hasn't come. This wasn't how I was planning to take my ministry public, Mom. Are you sure I need to do this? I'm assuming Jesus decided to say yes, and this is just me. This not in this scripture, so this is my imagination. It's very important to know who's asking, right? It's because of who's asking. It's you trust the person that's relaying the evidence. If it was anybody else, if it wasn't Jesus' mother, I don't know if he performs this sign, but because his mom asks, he decides to do it if you've read the story before. And so she knows that she's got him, right? Mary knows that she's got Jesus. He's going to do his thing that she's seen so many times. And so she leaves and tells the other waiters, just do whatever he tells you. And if you imagine, I can just really imagine Robin Fruinlord right now in my mind of just do whatever he tells you and then walks away and takes care of something else. If you don't know Robin, meet her in the hospitality area after the service. But that's what I'm imagining happening right now. Walking away and going to do whatever else she had to take care of. Do whatever Jesus tells you to do. Because Jesus wasn't necessarily a big deal as of yet. I don't know why John decided to start his gospel with this sign. Why out of the 7 he started this sign. But as John rehearsed this in memory, maybe it dawned on him that this was the perfect introduction. Not for the wedding guests, because they never knew, but for us. This was the perfect introduction for us, future readers of John's Gospels. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding 20 to 30 gallons. So the Pharisees and all the Jews, they have this ceremonial hand washing that they would do to keep up the tradition of the elders. They want to hold these traditions, and these stone jars were icons of the covenant and the traditions Jesus had come to replace. These were icons of the old. These were icons of something that was really significant for the people that were at the wedding. And for Jesus to perform the miracle in these ceremonial washing stones, which were iconic to the people, something that Jesus was coming to fulfill that moment of history and introduce something brand new, this was a perfect way to start the 7 signs to say, this is what's coming. I am coming to do something entirely new. This was necessary for your time and your people group in this time zone, but this was for a nation in a certain time. I have come to do something that is for all nations, for all time. And so he performs a miracle in something that was iconic for something, he performs a sign for something that was iconic for what he was coming to replace or what he was coming to fulfill. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water, so they filled them to the brim. Fill these jars with water. And at this point, the people at the wedding, that's just what you do in these stones, right? They had no idea what was coming. No one would have expected Jesus to do what he was about to do. Maybe they were thinking, Jesus, dude, we already washed our hands. We're good. Let's continue to party. Let's continue to celebrate. We don't need to do these ceremonies anymore. So they didn't know what Jesus was about to do. I love this quote. It says, "The water provided for purification as laid down by Jewish law and custom stands for the whole ancient order of the Jewish ceremony, which Christ was to replace with something better." The water provided for purification as laid down by Jewish law and custom stands for the whole ancient order of Jewish ceremony, which Christ was to replace with something better. It was a perfect introduction for Jesus' ministry. So much foreshadowing happening in this one moment, in this one sign that we read so many times and just look over and just say, yep, Jesus turned water into wine. He wanted to make sure everyone was having a good time, right? We can just glance over these things, but there's so much foreshadowing going on here for what is to come. He says, fill them up with water as they were normally used. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. So like the head, what do you call it? Waiter. The person that was just making sure that everything was going according to plan. Take it to the head master of the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water. And if you've never read this account of the first sign, you'd go, oh no, like that's for your ceremonial cleaning. Don't you drink that water. But John assumes, again, that so many people had read this that everyone already knows how it's going to turn out. John just assumes that his readers knows what's coming. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. That had been turned into wine. No one would have expected that. I mean, again, we can so easily just glance over these events of history in the Bible and we just go, oh, yeah, that's great. Jesus turns water into wine. What's next? But could you imagine being at a wedding where you run out of wine and all of a sudden he turns water into wine? Blows my mind, sorry. He did not realize where it had come from, this is the master, through the servants who had, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, so he called him privately, didn't want to embarrass him maybe. Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. Because once people have had too much to drink, they don't care if the wine tastes bad, right? So we always bring out the best wine for first. Why did you save this amazing stuff for last? Nobody's really going to notice how good it is. I mean, maybe they're coming off their celebration, but we normally wait for them to have too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. You have saved the best until now. You've saved the best wine until now. Well, God had as well. God has as well. The sacrificial system set the stage for the new introduced by Jesus. What came before was only a shadow of the good things to come. So much foreshadow happening in this sign, in this water into wine sign. Saving God, the people of Israel, they had no idea what was to come. They had no idea what was to come. They thought they had it good now. Well, Jesus was coming to introduce something brand new and way better than anything they could have ever imagined. This was more than a miracle. This was a sign. And what do signs do? They point towards something. And it was pointing towards the identity of Jesus. That Jesus, everything Jesus is going to claim to be over the next several chapters in the book of John is true. Is true because these signs point towards Jesus is who he says he is. It's pointing to something, to somebody. But nobody would fully understand in that moment until later. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Why did his disciples believe in him? Because Just believe? Just have faith? No. There was a reason to believe. There was a reason to believe because of what they witnessed. There's a reason to believe because of the sign is pointing towards Jesus is indeed who he says he was. It wasn't, Jesus just didn't go to his disciples and say, hey, just believe and hope everything works out. Hey, just have faith. Just have faith. No, there were signs that pointed towards it. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. So after this, he had many siblings, so they all went and gathered in this place for a few days. And so it began. The ministry begins. Unlike John, maybe you're wondering this. Unlike John, our faith does not come from seeing. And you're like, what? You've just been talking about it's all about what we see? Well, we're not necessarily watching Jesus do all of these. Our faith comes from hearing. Our faith doesn't come from seeing, it comes from hearing. We're not just asked to just believe. We're not required to take it by faith. We're invited to believe what happened based on the testimony of people who were there. Just like your teacher says 8 times 8 is 64, you trust your teacher. These are trusted testimonies of people that witnessed Jesus do what we read about in the Bible. They were not writing the Bible. They were documenting what they witnessed. They are trusted testimonies of the life of Jesus. There are 4 of them, and then there are letters afterwards to talk in hindsight, but we're not told to believe just off of blind faith, something that's out there that you can't really figure out, and when somebody sort of questions your faith, you're like, well, I don't know. I'm just told to have faith. I'm just told to believe. No, we are told we believe, we have faith because of what we hear from eyewitnesses that were there, that we can trust these people and what they said. People like John, people like Peter, people like Mark, people like Luke. And John came away from his experience with Jesus convinced that God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him will have life, will have eternal life. He was convinced that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, that he is the Son of God. I know it sounds crazy, but this is what it was, John would say. And it's hard to wrap your mind around, but this is what was happening. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and full of truth. John would say, I was just a bystander. I was just a bystander there, but I thought it was important and significant to document my experience with the rabbi from Nazareth. I was just a bystander, but it changed my life. And I hope, as you read my gospel, John would say, that it would change yours too. That when you look deeper into these signs, that you will see that it is pointing to you towards something that is life-changing, life-altering. But not just so you would know what happened. No, it's bigger than that. It's not just so you know what happened. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name, just as I have had. Just as I have had. Before the series is over, as we move from sign to sign, as we go through each sign, my hope is that you would believe and that you would have life in his name as well. That we would go from not just taking it by faith, not just, just believe, bro, but that you would take it from hearing the words of John because from what he had seen. My hope is that you would believe and have faith in his name as well, not because you took it by faith, but because you took it from John, an eyewitness to what Jesus said and did. John was just a bystander. It changed his life. and through the words that he documented, which we call the Gospel of John, it's my prayer that it will change yours as well.